Okay, let's review fluid and electrolytes, chapter 27. So if we start talking about fluid and electrolytes, we know that there are two compartments within the body that hold our fluids. We have our intracellular fluid, which is basically going to be inside the cells, located mostly in the cytosol. And then we have your extracellular fluid. That's going to be your interstitial fluid, your plasma, and other body fluids, like your cerebral spinal fluid would be considered an extracellular fluid. We know that the intracellular fluid makes up about 2/3 of your total body water, and the extracellular fluid obviously is the other 1/3. We know that different cells within the body will contain varying amounts of fluids, so we know muscular cells or muscle cells have a higher fluid content than, say, fat cells do. So if we're looking at the differences between males and females, females tend to be about 50% of their total body composition is fluids because they have more fat cells, and men is about 60% since they tend to have more muscle within their body, so they have more fluid contained within their body. So if we're looking at fluid regulation, and we know at homeostasis that the ECF and the ICF are in balance with the two solutions being isotonic. So if we're looking at where this homeostasis is measured and maintained, where we're monitoring and adjusting the body fluid composition, we're looking at the ECF. So all monitoring and adjustments of body fluid are taking place in the ECF. So we're looking at your plasma, we're monitoring the plasma, and we're monitoring things like your cerebral spinal fluid. We also know that there's no receptors that directly monitor fluid or electrolyte balance. We're basically looking at plasma volume, and we're looking at osmotic concentration of those extracellular fluids to maintain homeostasis. We know that cells can't move water molecules by active transport. It's a process of osmosis. We know that water is going to follow salt, and so the water is going to move out of an area of lower concentration to an area of higher concentration. So osmosis is the process where that water moves. And we know that the body's water or electrolyte content will increase with dietary gains if they exceed environmental losses, and if the losses exceed the gains, and will fall if losses exceed gains. So we'll see changes taking place with the loss or gain of those electrolyte or water content. So if we look at this image, we're looking at decreased extracellular fluid volume. So we have water loss from the extracellular fluid. Reducing the volume makes the solution hypertonic with respect to the intracellular fluid. So then we're going to have the water undergo osmosis and move out of the intracellular fluid into the extracellular fluid, taking you back again to homeostasis. So it's an osmotic shift of that water that takes place and moves it out of the ICF and into the ECF. Alright, so if we start looking at the concentrations of cations and anions in body fluids, so we know that the intracellular fluid contains most of the potassium within the body, and then that the interstitial fluid and the plasma that are extracellular fluid contain most of the sodium within our body. We also know when we start looking at proteins, we find proteins in the plasma that help form that osmotic concentration, and then we have some proteins down here in the interstitial fluids, but most of the proteins are going to be found also within that intracellular fluid. Again, helping to form that resting membrane potential across that cell membrane. So then if we start looking at ways that we lose fluid from our body, or the ways that we gain or lose fluid from our body, so we're looking at the production of metabolic water that takes place. So we're looking at fluid shift, is looking at the loss of water from that if we have loss of water in the ECF, then we're going to shift that water out of the ICF into the ECF, as we just saw. So we have oxidative phosphorylation in a mitochondria that takes place and produces this metabolic water, which will then go into the extracellular fluid. We also have water that is taken into our body by eating and drinking as it comes into our body. Water loss basically takes place in respiration and evaporation from moist surfaces. So we see about 1,150 milliliters is lost through this respiration and evaporation from our surface areas. We also lose some water in our feces, about 150 milliliters. We have water that is secreted by our sweat glands, and this can be variable. So if you're sitting inside all day watching TV, not doing very much, obviously you're not going to have very much sweat produced, but if you're out exercising, so this is variable. And then we have water lost in urine, which is about 1,000 milliliters per day. So we want to make sure that we are replacing the water that we lose through all of these processes by either ingesting it. Ingesting it is the way that we're going to have to do this. So dehydration, long-term transfer from the cells into the extracellular fluid, can't maintain it, so then you're going to have some of those homeostatic mechanisms that are going to kick in to try to keep our fluids in balance. Okay, so if we start looking at homeostatic regulation of sodium, so we need to keep the sodium levels appropriate in our body. Too high of sodium or too low of sodium can both be very, very dangerous. So relatively small changes in sodium are accommodated by changes in the extracellular fluid. So if we start looking at this graphic here, so we have increased sodium levels in the extracellular fluid. Obviously your diet can be one of those things that can increase that sodium level. So the osmosis receptors in the hypothalamus are stimulated, and when they're stimulated, oops, went the other way, we have ADH that is secreted. So secretion of the ADH is actually going to restrict water loss. It's actually going to help stimulate our thirst and definitely promoting additional water consumption. So increased sodium levels is called hypernatremia. So natremia, R-E, oops, that's not a very good E, M-I-A. Hypernatremia. So hypernatremia, natremium, meaning sodium. So this is increased level of sodium within your system. So this is commonly from dehydration or a real high intake of sodium. So we have the ADH restricting water loss, stimulates thirst, promoting additional water consumption. We're going to have recall of fluids, basically because the ECF osmolarity increases, water shifts out of the ICF, increasing ECF volume and lowering sodium concentration. Then we have homeostasis that's being restored back to normal levels. So if we have homeostasis disturbed with decreased sodium levels, and this is going to be, I'm just going to write the first part of it, hyponatremia. And hyponatremia is basically, that's supposed to be an O, not an A, hyponatremia. And this can be caused by overhydration or inadequate salt intake. So we're going to have the osmoreceptors again in that hypothalamus are going to be stimulated, are going to be inhibited, sorry, not stimulated, inhibited. So as the osmotic concentration drops by 2% or more, ADH secretion decreases, so thirst is suppressed, water losses at the kidneys increase. Whoops, wrong way. Water loss reduces ECF volume, concentrates ions, and then you're going to return back to homeostasis. So make sure you understand hypernatremia, increased sodium levels. We have the secretion of ADH, restricting water loss, stimulates thirst, promotes additional water consumption, and then we have increasing ECF volume, lowering sodium concentrations, homeostasis return. Too little sodium or hyponatremia, osmoreceptors are inhibited, ADH secretion decreases, thirst is suppressed, water losses at the kidneys increase, water loss reduces the ECF volume, concentrates those ions, and so it increases sodium levels in the ECF. And we're just looking at sodium here, we're not looking at volumes. So now if we start looking at the integration of fluid volume regulation and sodium ion concentrations in body fluids. So we have homeostasis is disturbed. So rising extracellular fluid volume by fluid gain or fluid and sodium gain. So fluid and sodium or just fluid gain. So again, we have increased blood volume. We're going to have atrial distension with that increased extracellular fluid. So now we have the natriuretic peptides that are going to be released by the cardiac cells because they responded to that increase in volume. So we're going to have increased sodium loss in the urine. The natriuretic peptide is going to cause sodium loss in the urine. We're going to have an increased water loss in the urine. We're going to have reduced thirst, and we're going to have inhibition of ADH, aldosterone, epinephrine, and norepinephrine release. So we're not going to have ADH being released, so we're going to be losing lots and lots of fluids, reducing our blood volume, and reducing our blood pressure, returning us back to homeostasis. So if we have falling extracellular fluid volume by fluid loss or fluid and sodium loss, so we're going to have decreased blood volume and blood pressure. So then now we're going to have renin that's going to be secreted. We're going to activate that angiotensin II. So we have the renin, the enzyme renin that's going to activate angiotensinogen, activating angiotensin I, angiotensin II, and then that's going to release the aldosterone, the hormone aldosterone from the adrenal gland, and we're also going to have increased ADH release. So the combined effects of the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone, and ADH are going to be increased urinary sodium retention, decreased urinary water loss, increased thirst, and increased water intake, taking us back to rising ECF volume. The angiotensin is also going to cause vasoconstriction, trying to raise that blood pressure back up. All right, so if we start looking at potassium imbalance, so potassium is a pretty important ion within our system. So our major gain is going to be through our digestive tract absorption. So about 100 milliequivalents per day is how much we take in of potassium. Our major loss is through our kidneys, and this is controlled by aldosterone, which regulates that sodium-potassium exchange pump. So when we start looking at hypokalemia, which is falling levels of potassium within our system, so we can have muscular weakness, we can have paralysis, and it can be potentially lethal if it has effects on the heart. So things that cause hypokalemia, diuretics can cause this. They increase the volume of urine produced. So the diuretics, you lose a lot of potassium with those diuretics. And then aldosteronism, which is excessive aldosterone secretion, resulting in hypokalemia, so overstimulating sodium retention and potassium losses. So the sodium-potassium exchange, you will retain the sodium and get rid of the potassium. We also know that we can have this take place, the opposite of this take place with high amounts of hydrogen ions within the system. So if we have chronically low body pH, this is going to promote that hyperkalemia by interfering with potassium excretion at the kidneys. So it's usually a sodium-potassium exchange, but when we have a very low pH, it's a sodium hydrogen or a sodium hydrogen exchange, so we can end up with too much potassium within our system. And kidney failure due to damage or disease will prevent normal potassium secretion that can produce hyperkalemia. And then there's several drugs promoting diuresis by blocking sodium reabsorption at the kidneys. So when the sodium reabsorption slows down, so does the potassium secretion, and hyperkalemia can result. So high concentrations of potassium can be just as dangerous as low concentrations. So we can have these cardiac arrhythmias that will appear, and so it can be very, very dangerous also within the system. So if we look at the distal convoluted tubules, and this again, you don't have to memorize these images, but this is looking at the sodium-potassium exchange. So this is the tubular fluid inside the distal convoluted tubules. We see that we have an exchange of sodium for potassium, and this is all controlled by the aldosterone within our system. So you can see that it's taking the sodium into the circulation and the potassium out, because aldosterone holds on to that sodium. And again, if we're looking, this is going into, I thought, this is going into the bicarbonate. So again, here we're looking at the sodium chloride exchange that's taking place. So we are actually losing sodium at the leak channel, so we have the sodium-potassium exchange take place here, and we're losing sodium, and this is the sodium-potassium pump. And we'll talk about this image in the next section.